Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us virtually tonight. My name is Annika Schneider, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Exhibitions and Artist Programs at Minnesota Center for Book Arts. MCBA celebrates the book as a vibrant contemporary art form that takes many shapes. From the traditional crafts of papermaking, letterpress printing, and hand bookbinding to experimental art making and self-publishing techniques, MCBA supports the limitless creative evolution of book arts through book arts workshops and programming for adults, youth, families, K-12 students, and teachers. MCBA is located in the Open Book Building in downtown Minneapolis, alongside our partner nonprofit organizations, the Loft Literary Center and Milkweed Editions. It has been an honor to bring Paper is People to life in our main gallery. If you have not had the chance, I encourage you to see the exhibition before it closes on August 12th. The exhibition will next travel to San Francisco Center for the Book and will be on view from October to December 2023. I would also like to thank our supporters, the National Endowment for the Arts and the Center for Craft, for supporting the research and the exhibition. We will first hear from our curators and artists, and then to move to a moderated Q&A portion. As Kirsten said, please utilize Zoom's Q&A feature for this. Without further ado, I am pleased to introduce the two curators, Stephanie Sauer and Tia Blassingame. Stephanie is a writer, book artist, publisher, and author. And Tia is a book artist who reconstructs charged images and histories for a nuanced discussion on the issues of race and racism. Full bios are available in the chat. And now I turn it over to Tia and Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Annika, and thank you everyone at MCBA for hosting us tonight. We're honored to be here with Paper is People exhibiting artists Skye Tafoya, Page Chang, Chenta Laury, and Hong Hong. Tonight's panel, much like the exhibition currently on display at MCBA, seeks to open a conversation around what paper is across cultures. So what happens, for example, if we broaden our understanding of the forms of papermaking that have been ignored? We'll be asking questions tonight like what happens when we consider this substrate as a vessel for collective memory, as a body, as a site of meaning, or even as an ancestor.
In order of appearance, Skye Tafoya, Page Chang, Chenta Laury, and Hong Hong will be discussing paper traditions like paper weaving influenced by basketry, kappa and tapa bark cloths, and site-specific papermaking. After their presentations, they will have an opportunity to converse and ask questions of one another. Then we will open up the Q&A to the audience. If any of the panelists drop out due to Wi-Fi issues, Stephanie and I may pop up and shuffle the order a bit, but we'll have Skye Tafoya start off our panel. Skye.
Thank you, Tia. Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, let me start my timer. Hi, thank you for coming to this Zoom, and thank you, Tia and Stephanie, for putting on this fabulous show. My name is Rhiannon Skye Tafoya, I go by Skye. I am from Eastern Bend, Cherokee on my maternal side and Santa Clara Pueblo on my paternal side. I'm currently located in Cherokee, North Carolina, where I was born and raised for the most part of my life. And I'm just gonna start my screen share. Is everything looking okay?
It looks good, Skye.
Okay, thank you. So my introduction to paper making isn't like literally paper making. I think when I was thinking about it, I really thought that it came in the form of printmaking, like 14 years ago when I started printmaking. But what it really was being around my granny, and that's her pictured on the left side and her basket pictured on the right side. And I think just being in her house when I was a kid, like, because we all grew up in like a compound. That was really significant, just to see her weaving baskets like all the time, and also using natural dyes. And she would use her dyes on the stove, and she would also use dyes outside in the sunlight. And I really, really thought that when I first started thinking about this paper making and paper traditions, then I just assumed that we didn't think about it as, like what Stephanie said, like a vessel or a way to tell these stories through the making of baskets. It just was a whole different, kind of opened my eyes to whenever I started having these conversations with Tia and with Stephanie. And so she is my main inspiration. I mean, she's the one who kind of came back into my life, like spiritually, whenever I had just finished grad school and I came back home and I was stuck. I was like at a point where I didn't know what to do with an art career or an art degree. And I was looking for all these jobs and I wasn't getting any any callbacks or like anything to like push me into the direction of any type of career. So I was picking up these really small jobs and making art when I had the time to. But so when I came home in 2018, I started a mock-up to apply for the WSW grant for the bookmaking or book publishing. And so that was when I started making Onegid, and it was basically inspired by my granny first and foremost. Her name is Martha, but it was also inspired just by coming home and seeing all the basket traditions that is in a lot of families around here. And so when I came home, I just saw so many baskets in my family's house and friends' houses, and it got me back into this motion of like, well, I really want to start making baskets again. Whenever I lived in New Mexico, I was making baskets with my dad, but it wasn't out of the same material. And I noticed that every time I would start art projects, like the basket would just like kind of come back into play. So again, it just came back into play when I came home after grad school. And this is the final book that I made at WSW. And then so I was like thinking about that, and I got a residency at my undergrad school, the Institute of American Indian Arts, when a little time after this book, I think about 2 years after I made this book. And so when I got to IAI again, it just kind of, those weavings just came back. Of course, I was going there to make paper weavings, but if you see the basket in the back, I made that when I was in undergrad, I think in 2012. And that was really inspired by the basketry relationship that I had with my dad at the time. We would go pick red willow in the winter and just weave these baskets. And he actually helped me weave this together. The base is welded, and then with found wire and baling wire, we just kind of put it all together. But it was really nice to see that basket. I left it in the foundry, and I had ran into one of the professors that worked in the foundry, and they're like, "Oh, your basket is still there." And I was kind of in disbelief. I thought it would have been junked or like reused or something, but I got it back and I was able to keep it. It's actually at my house now. It's been traveling around a little bit. So this is where I kind of started the weavings for big Onegid or Ego Onegid. And it was a lot different from the practices that like I utilize in my paper weaving, because a lot of my paper weaving is very tiny. I tend to go for like 1/8 of an inch or 1/16 of an inch every single time that I cut my strips down and start weaving them together. And so this one was a little strange for me. They are 1.25 inches wide. And again, this is the color plan paper that I used in this, the same colors. I really like color plan paper because it's affordable, and it comes in so many beautiful colors. And these are so specific to the natural dyes that the Cherokee baskets utilize, which are comprised of like yellow root, bloodroot, walnut, and butternut. And butternut, not to be confused with like the squash, but the butternut tree, which is very similar to the walnut tree, but the butternut is like a little bit more oblong than the walnut actually is. And so one of the main reasons like I decided to go so big was that I had the space to work big. And I was invited to do a solo show at Linfield University in McMinnville, Oregon. And so this was just like something that it just felt right to be able to put into a really large space. And when I was making the book, my partner and I were talking about it. And so when it stands up, when all the panels are up on it, it forms a basket. And we were talking about the ways that our people have traditionally built houses, and a lot of the structures are woven inside of the house first and then plastered with the mud and other things on top of that. So like the weaving structure isn't just a like something to like gift each other and like to put on your shelf. It's actually like, you know, a way to build homes and to build security. And so these are just some process shots of the weavings. I think these are measured at pretty close to 4 foot by 8 foot, maybe just a little bit under. And these are just kind of getting ready to be packed up. And you can see that because the two papers, it'll make the inverse on the other side. And then when I got to Linfield, the Institute of American Indian Arts, I think she was the director of the artist in residence program. She was really helpful, and she mailed my large basket and the panels to this one up to Linfield from Santa Fe. And so I was able to just open up those packages when I got to Linfield and just start putting it all together. And so right here is a video of us cutting all the wood panels, and then I painted them afterwards. It was a lot of fun. I used to work in wood, but it's so intimidating at times. So I kind of just quit it. Also, big structures are kind of hard to house. This is the gallery shot of right before putting it all together. And so I had to put all the panels into these, the weavings into these black panels, and then use some linen. If you can see, it's right here on this box. And this box, my metal basket came in, or the crate that my metal basket came in. And so I use this for the hinges on this larger basket, or this larger onigid. And this base is 8 foot by 8. And this is kind of just cleaning up all of the scuff marks that kind of got acquired whenever I was putting everything together. And then the man who helped me cut all the panels, he also made these little stands for me, which was really, really sweet of him. And it helps hold all of the panels up whenever it's displayed. And then this is the end result while it's open and part of the show at Linfield before T and Stephanie inquired about it to be put in Paper as People. That's all that I have. Thank you, guys.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Skye. So we'll move on to Paige.
Aloha, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, my name is Page Chang, and I am an artist and an educator and a Native Hawaiian kappa practitioner. So I'm sort of focusing tonight on really what kappa is. A lot of people don't understand or know what Native Hawaiian kappa is. So let me share my screen. Okay, everyone can see this. Let's see, how do I? Okay, so my presentation is called A Cultural Foundation, kappa, a cultural foundation of the past, present, and future. So quickly about me, I am an artist, and as a Hawaiian woman in Hawaii, I strive to make sure that I present authentic images of Hawaii and Hawaiian people at all times. I've been an educator for 30 years. And as a teacher, I also really try to connect our lessons to Hawaii and to give our students a cultural context, either with whatever our assignment is, and definitely with the materials that we're using. And I've been a kappa maker for only 10 years. So we have a saying in Hawaii, makahana ka ike. And that means that the learning comes from doing. So for me, what I know is literally from my hands-on experience as a kappa maker and kind of trial and error and learning how to use the plants and how to make the tools. What it means to be a kappa maker basically is what I do, following the teachings of my makua and my kumu kappa. Those are my kappa teachers. I make my own tools. I build my own soils. I grow, I cultivate, and I gather my materials. And I process them into art, fashion, and other useful or desirable objects. So, being new, basically to the practice, only 10 years into it, the more I learn, the more I know I have to learn. There's so much. And as I said, what I'm doing and what I'm practicing is really just from my hands-on experience. So what is kappa? Kappa is different than the rest of tapa or bark cloths from around Polynesia. It's our ancient traditional fabric of Hawaii. So we think of it as a textile and not paper. It was used for everyday clothing, for bedding, household use, decoration, ceremony, from catching babies to burial coverings. It was a part of every aspect and every phase of life. And it was in everyone's home, different sizes, different styles, different colors. And like I said, it's similar to other bark cloths like siapo and masi and tapa, but it incorporates at least 2 additional steps that our Hawaiians figured out. And that would be the fermentation process and the finishing with a watermark on the material. So there's a saying in Hawaii also, ka'aka honua ike kapa aka wahine. And that means the world revolves around the kapa made by the women. And I love this quote because it really talks about how prevalent kapa was historically. Just so you know, kind of the process that we go through, we start with, I use welke trees primarily. You can make kapa out of other trees, but we start in our mala welke. That's my welke garden. Then we ihi ika ilio waho. We scrape off the outer bark. Then we uhole ika ha ana ana. That means we peel off that inner bast fiber. And then we pound that with a hohoa on a hohaku on a rock, and that's called ho'omo'omo'o. And once we've made that material, we soak it in water, lau huki ika mo'omo'o in the water, and that starts the fermentation process. And there, like I said, there are a lot of ways to do this, but this is the one that I prefer. Then using my tools, my ie kuku, we pound the what is now called the kai on another tool called a kua la'au, and we end up pounding that into kapa. So it's very process or heavy, and it's part of the reason I really think I love it so much. So this is our ancient traditional fabric of Hawaii. It was considered the highest form of textile finery in all of Polynesia. Its beauty, its color, its texture. It was produced in a rainbow of colors, but now, you know, these colors have faded, so we don't have a lot of examples of all of the different colors that were available back then. So what I like to talk about is, what did kapa represent culturally to our native Hawaiian ancestors? Another saying, he ali'i ka'aina he kaua ke kanaka. The land is chief and the man is servant. And kapa making really embodies this concept of the reciprocal relationship between the land and the people. If we care for the land takes care of us. So this was a thriving, large-scale commercial design manufacture industry in pre-contact Hawaii that served over 1 million people, right? Everybody did this, but it brilliantly and sustainably used the natural resources of the aina, of the land, to do this. And it's an example of aloha aina, which means loving the land, and malama aina, which is caring for the land. So, you know, this practice, like all of our native practices, really was in partnership with the aina. So through my own practice, you know, through my own connections to my ancestors, I know that in order for them to have this massive industry, it took large scale, it took many dedicated spaces for the farmers, for the carvers, for the gatherers, for the artists and the designers and the kapa makers. It had its own mo'olelo, it had its own stories, its origin stories, its genealogies. We have our own gods and goddesses that inspire and protect the kapa practitioner. And also, through my own experience, what I have learned is that through this process of working with the fermented material, like of the kapa as it's fermenting, and you also have to ferment a lot of the dye material, plus a lot of the dye material has medicinal qualities. They have medicinal qualities. I think that being a kapa maker probably made you a healthier person, right? At a microbial level. So maybe the kapa maker and the wearer, you know, their health was enhanced by using and wearing and making this product. Besides the physical and mental work that's involved in making kapa, that strengthened your mind and body, the manufacturing process is social, and interactive, and that strengthened our community bonds and bolstered spirits, as this is exemplified with some of my girlfriends. So this whole practice was an example of an ethical, environmentally healthy, industrial practice that didn't harm the land or the people. In fact, it nourished both. So, you know, the reason that I'm involved and I have fallen in love with this practice is very much about it being, that the practice itself is so beautiful and it being a physical expression of aloha aina, loving the land. So we almost lost kapa. It was, you know, shortly after contact was made with Hawaii, you know, the rapid influx of the modern world came in, and it brought new technologies, practices, animals, plants, and of course it brought in woven fabric, but it also brought in diseases that wiped out 80% of the population. So 8 out of 10 people died. As well as the natural resources, those were, many of them were also left to die, or with few or no practitioners to care for them. We lost so many natural resources. So Hawaiians did their best to survive and assimilate, so they stopped making kapa. But luckily, like from women like Pua Van Dorp here, she worked tirelessly to bring this practice back from the very edges of Kanaka consciousness, thank goodness. And I like to say now, e kokoloana ke a'a, the roots are spreading because there are many of us, and two of us tonight here, who are making kapa. So the modern relevance of kapa in my modern day practice, it's so important. It's not just restoring a cultural practice. We're literally restoring ecosystems that were lost. So starting again with the soil and attracting the right microorganisms that are attracting the bugs, that are attracting the birds. So we're rebuilding these native ecosystems, plus the resources. I have to grow all of my resources, or if I go and gather elsewhere in my community or my ahupua'a, I'm taking care of those resources. We're also restoring the language. There's this whole canon of vocabulary that's just about kapa and kapa making. If we're not practicing making kapa, then we lose those words too. Plus, we're restoring Native Hawaiian expression and that kind of aesthetic idea that is very Hawaiian. So I'm going to just take you quickly through my personal journey of reclaiming this practice. And rather than focusing on each piece, I'm just going to kind of slide us through it really quickly. And I'm sorry, I didn't start a timer. Can someone tell me what my time is? Is anyone keeping time?
You're fine. Just keep going, Paige.
Okay, so this is kind of me in my journey of learning to be a kapa maker. And I don't have music, so I'm just going to do a little chant for you guys. Ku ku kapa e ke ku ana ke kapa e ho 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 ie ho o pulu vai e ku i alale la I mo o huli ke ala ake kua. Ku kapa e ke ku ana ke kapa e ho ho ie ho o pulu vai e ku I alale la I mo o huli ke alo ake kua. Ku kapa e. So the reclamation of this textile has filled me with so much joy. And I don't know, I know we went through that quickly, but my work has really become a personal expression of my commitment to protecting Hawaiian knowledge, cultural practices, and the Aina. And it's also a little bit of a protest against the continued injustices against Hawaii. You know, I'm protesting against all of this modern stuff that's come in and has just trashed so many practices and so many resources. And I just love this picture. This is the sweet little baby boy down the street, and we made him a diaper. And then the piece on the right is actually my one of my cousins, and we wrapped him in kapa before we put him out to sea. So as we move forward, you know, I want to think really clearly about what I want to leave behind and what I want to take with me. And as this practice grows, so does our collective recovery of Ike Kupuna, our ancestral knowledge. I think that reclaiming and building upon this particular successful cultural practice offers us a pathway to a sustainable future. And I think we all need to be asking the question, you know, when we look at these native practices that really did think about how we affected our environment, we all need to be asking the question, who made it? How is it made? What's it made of? How do you dispose of it? Does it nourish the earth or does it poison the earth, right? And as we're all buying all this stuff and all this single-use stuff, we really need to start focusing back on our natural resources. And as I move forward, I ask myself questions about how I can replace kind of these imposter, unhealthy practices or products with healthier local products and native practices. So I ask questions like, how can I replace polyester clothing and plastic accessories with kapa? And so we're figuring out how to do that. And by continuing to make these pieces, I make sure that kapa making not only stays in our consciousness, we actually get to put it on our bodies too. Working with the University of Hawaii, we did a hemp study. So I started comparing hemp to Welke, and I'm investigating how to use the Welke fibers the same way that a lot of modern people are using hemp fibers to replace all kinds of things. I'm using Welke to make cordage, to make rope and string. And, you know, can we use that to replace all this plastic rope that we find in Hawaii? It's just the ocean is filled with it. And then from that cordage project, we learned to make cordage out of coconut, and we dipped it in beeswax, and now they're using that in several coral restoration labs. And not only is this replacing the zip ties they're using, it's also attracting native species of limu, of seaweed, algae. I'm also taking the Welke and I'm mixing it with native starches. So I've made bioplastic out of pia starch, kalo or taro starch, and turmeric or olena starch. And I do a mix with the Welke fiber, and I've been making these fun little plastic bowl things. So the way I know to move forward and to carry this all forward is also to teach. You know, how can I use kapa making to enhance modern education here in Hawaii and give kids a real sense of identity and place? And how can kapa making reduce or replace, or at least reduce, the pain of generational trauma that is still very much alive here in Hawaii? So thank you very much. I appreciate you all having me, and I hope that you enjoyed my presentation.
Thank you so much, Paige. And now we have Chenta Laury up.
Aloha, everyone. I just want to begin by thanking Tia and Stephanie for organizing this conversation. I do feel like it's very important, and what a gift to be on this panel with all you wonderful artists and artisans. It's a great honor. Let me go to my shared screen now. I want to begin also by thanking Paige for that wonderfully inspiring presentation of the rich history of this tradition of kapa making. My work actually straddles several different fiber traditions, including patchwork inspired by African-American quilters, and felting, which has traditions in Scandinavia, Finland, where I also have some of my ethnic heritage is from, but also Mongolia and through parts of Europe. And then I too am a kapa maker, which I feel connects me to this place, which is where I grew up and where I currently live and work. And so today I just thought I would focus on the traditions that relate to the pieces that are in the Papers People show. So I will mostly be speaking about my practice in relation of kapa making and patchwork. The image is just me in my studio with some of the wool, cotton, and kapa in the background. And I just, for me, the entry point to all of these traditions was really my passion and love for natural fibers. The vocabulary, the implicit beauty has always drawn me to them. And I just feel there's a whole language and a whole, there's so much metaphor and inspiration just within these fibers that are, you know, that provided by nature, that has inspired me to explore them in many different forms and to combine them, as you will see. So to begin with, my journey in learning how to process and work with kapa began just growing up in Hawaii, where my mother had traveled throughout Polynesia and brought back examples of tapa, which is the catch-all phrase for kind of bark cloth from throughout Polynesia. As Paige said, kapa is specific to the way in which the bark cloth was processed here in Hawaii. But I grew up with examples of seeing Hawaiian kapa and other forms of bark cloth. And I just always loved it and wanted to learn how to make it. But it wasn't until 2015 when I met people here on Maui, where I currently live, that knew how to make it. Because again, as Paige kind of gave you an overview of the history, it was a practice that was almost completely lost. There was huge interruption due to colonization. So pre-contact, it was ubiquitous, and there were copper makers in every household. And then within a generation, and the introduction of woven fabrics, production of kapa virtually ended here in Hawaii. And so that gap really has made it hard to find practitioners. And it was, as Paige mentioned, in the late 60s, early 70s, when there was a revival of culture and re-exploration of how all the examples that remained were made. And so I was so thrilled in 2015 when I came across who was willing to teach me, and I began meeting with a group of women, about maybe 5 or 6 women. We met for 2 days, once a month, for about 2 years. And that was when I fell in love with the fiber. And, you can't, as Paige said, it's especially then, it was very hard to find the tools. And we all had our tools kind of shaped by native carvers who used the native woods. And then we had to carve and fashion all the tools that we needed to even participate in this practice. So on the left is the plant of vauke, as we call it in Hawaii, which is the paper mulberry tree. And then there's me, just a couple examples of me processing just the initial phase of stripping the bark. And I'm not going to go deep into the processing because I feel that Paige did a pretty thorough introduction into all of the phases of stripping and soaking and retting the bark before it's then beaten. There's 2 main forms that I use kapa in, or the vauke in. I process it in two different ways. And one is after an initial beating on a stone anvil, pohaku. I pull, as you can see in this image, me pulling the individual fibers apart with my fingers. And so that is done. I do that prior to going through the final fermentation process and beating. But I also do process it more traditionally, I shouldn't say more traditionally, but in a way that's making a solid piece of cloth in the end, which you see on the right there, where I beat 3 different individual pieces. I lay them on top of each other and then basically felt them by beating them together. And that's the way that you get sort of width in your piece. So the image on the right shows you also one of the ohe kapala, which are the bamboo stamps that were used to apply several of the traditional designs on the kapa. This is also painted. There's the colors that you see are from native uki berries and olena, which is the turmeric root. And this is actually the first piece of kapa that I ever made. And my relationship to learning new practices is always to understand the material and trying to do it as faithfully as possible to the way in which it's brought and instructed and shared with me. As most of the practitioners I know today grow their own vauke because it's not grown everywhere. And as Paige said, taking care of it, malamaing it, which is the word for caring for the plant is critical because it really affects how easy it is to work with later, removing leaves, removing branches. And this is just all to say that it's an extremely time-consuming and labor-intensive practice. So you're only doing it out of it's truly a labor of love. And I just want to go back to the gap in knowledge from the interruption in the practice, although it was, you know, devastating for in so many ways to the Native community. One thing that one impact that it's had that I find interesting and hopeful is that it has forced practitioners today to do a lot of experimentation and exploring and really going back to the material itself to learn how to work with it. And Page is an example of that. All of the various innovations and experimentations that she's doing in her work for herself, the research, but also as an educator is very inspiring to me. And it is one of the reasons why I'm happy to continue participating in this tradition. One of the prompts we were given today had to do with how our work is adapting or shifting away from tradition, or how it's revitalizing it. And so while on the one hand, I am acutely aware of the importance and need to perpetuate and preserve the knowledge of how Hawaiian kapa was made for future generations. And well, I also participate in it, not only for that purpose, but it is an important means for me personally of connecting with this place, the land of this place, and the place where I was first oriented to myself in the world. I believe any cultural practice brings a deeper understanding of the natural resources and history of a place. And for example, you know, growing up here, I learned about the various mythological stories and the myth of Maui, the demigod, and how he harnessed the sun on top of the great mountain Haleakala to slow the sun down so his mother's kapa could dry more quickly. And that's just an example of something that I learned as a child that I only after actually learning to process kapa and understanding the importance of how long it takes to dry. It just brought that myth to a deeper understanding and appreciation. Let's see. So I just want to continue on here. This was the first piece I ever made. And again, it is slightly more traditional. I had been working with a lot of paper and thread. This is just an example of some of the work I was doing before I learned how to process kapa. And it then began to merge into my kapa practice. So this is the piece that I began kind of stitching into kapa, which was not done traditionally, but most of the way in which the cloth itself was made was traditional. There's a watermark in it, which you can't see unless it's backlit. But I began experimenting with stitching directly into the kapa. And this is another one where I embroidered into the kapa. I then began to cut it and layer it, and just began playing and experimenting with a different aesthetic. Let's see. And then I wanted to share these images, which relate to the other tradition that has influenced the pieces that are in this show. These are two quilts, patchwork quilts by the two women from the community at Gee's Bend in Alabama. Many of you may have heard about this particular community of African-American quilters. But I really, alongside of my kappa practice, had been thinking about my work just my work as a fine artist, and my identity, and having left Hawaii when I was quite young and spent several years moving around on the continent. I was sort of revisiting my relationship to the South, which is where much of my family's from, Alabama, my father's side. And I was really drawn to the history of patchwork quilt making. Less so to the tradition of quilting to make for warmth as a functional object, and more drawn to it in terms of thinking of it conceptually and metaphorically as salvaging pieces and stitching them together to create a unified whole. So I keep coming back to this metaphor of patchwork. And I'd like to just read a statement that I wrote for a series of pieces that I've made recently, of which the two of the three pieces in the show are part of. And so I'm just calling them my patchwork series. Patchwork is the stitching together of fabric from a variety of sources to create a larger cohesive whole. The concept of patchwork metaphorically and literally serve as a means for me to explore the relationship between my own identity and Hawaii, its people, traditions, values, and ecology. So for the series, I write, I'm interested in the relationship between identity and place, and how people construct and deconstruct individual identities within the context of a larger society. We shift, adapt, resist, or embrace the various influences within the social, cultural, and natural ecosystems in which we live. We find patterns, invent, and reorganize ourselves continuously as we move chronologically through time and geographically through space. In the most abstract terms, I see this as a relationship between parts to a larger whole. I associate the journey of finding and fitting various pieces of ourselves together with patchwork, articulating and finding meaning in the patterns, textures, and salvageable pieces of our identities. So this next image on the screen was my first piece that I titled Patchwork, and as you can see, it's a kappa. I stitched into it. It's different pieces from different stocks of kappa, but I also included the watermark, and I used alaya, which is the iron-rich clay soil to, and actually those are all of the color you see painted on is the alaya. And but I've also experimented with beating silk into the velke. So that was the first one. And this is an image of one of the pieces in the show, which I made during the pandemic. And it also, I started, thinking conceptually about the metaphor just inherent in the fiber. This iteration was really a meditation on my experience of just all of the dichotomies happening for me during the pandemic, kind of a concrete exploration of my attempt to hold the scale and plight of those suffering physically and economically with the health and beauty that I found in my surroundings, and simultaneously holding this fragility and strength. So the kappa itself can be very lacy and fragile, but also it's extremely strong. It can be used for cordage. It also has this ability to be very translucent or very thick and opaque, which I felt like the information coming to us during that time there was a lack of translucency. And so just playing with, again, concepts like embedded in the fiber, and then also just these relationships between the individual and collective. There's numerous stitches that you cannot see. There's also stitches that you can see, these bolder, larger threads, and just stitching it, holding it all together. So yes, that's one of the draws again is kind of what these fibers hold for us, the metaphor and meaning. Oh, here you go. Here's some more details. Just inherently in what they are. This is also a piece in the show. Again, this one's called Incremental, and it's sort of how we fit and rearrange ourselves. I have just the different forms of kappa, the spaces. We're not always completely whole. We're works in progress, in process. Let's see. So then I want to just share a couple more of the patchwork pieces. I mentioned that a third tradition that I work with is wool felting, making handmade felt. I'm just working with wool, and this piece, although you can't see it so clearly, has a base of wool below it that the kappa is stitched to. Let's see. So this piece is the third piece in the show that I have. It's called Restoration. Again, looking to the fiber itself for some meaning. This was a piece of kappa that you can see that I pulled apart. It wasn't really, I only did a single beating of it to soften it. But I was just thinking about all of the structures that support that kind of invisible structures that uphold our social systems, and how, this plant, unless you were to pull it apart and spend time with it, you don't see the structures that hold it together. In making it, there's often holes and gaps. And so here I was trying to kind of take cues from the actual fiber itself, the laciness of it, to kind of restore it and mend it. By exposing the seemingly invisible structures of an underlying form, I think we gain opportunities to mend and amend and restore truth to what we see and what we experience. And finally, just this is a piece of wool and silk that's also plant dyed. It's just one of my wool pieces, but you can see the relationship to patchwork. This was done before I started doing patchwork. And then the last few pieces here are combining the kappa or tapa with the wool and integrating all three of the traditions. Okay. Finally, the other reason why I make kappa is that it kind of goes back to what Paige was saying about reshaping my relationship to the geography of this place. All of these processes are very time consuming, and I feel that it has shifted my relationship to time. My artistic practice is where I go to process my lived experience and make sense of the world, and having to be more attuned to the cycles of nature and having a more reciprocal relationship to what I take from the land and how I live on the land is all really a gift of engaging in this practice. And yeah, I'm really grateful to Stephanie and Tia for, you know, I was a little resistant in the beginning when I was first invited to participate, because I was kind of holding on to this very narrow concept of kappa as cloth as opposed to paper, and was really just opening up and seeing how these substrates are endowed with meaning, and are, you know, just kind of getting rid of the hierarchy that paper has held, has just shifted how I read and how I look at other fiber traditions. And so I'm really grateful for that. And I think that's it. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you, Chenta. So next up, we have Hong Hong.
Hey, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. So my name is Hong Hong. I am currently in Massachusetts, and I just wanted to thank Tia and Stephanie for putting together this incredible exhibition. And I've just had so much fun listening to these amazing artists talk about their work, and I can't wait to get into the Q&A. So we've been talking a lot about tradition and community, and I think, like, for me, I think about tradition very broadly. A better word for me would be history. So specifically, I'm interested in the history of trade and the history of objects and materials. So what is a relationship between the migration of an object over time and the migration of people over time? You know, so where and how do these two types of distinct movements intersect or fall away from each other, and why? You know, what does that tell us about geopolitical relationships, about desire, et cetera? And I also think deeply about the value of specific objects in relation to the value of the bodies or the people who made these objects. So contemporarily, the labor that happens in China is worth very little. We think of all the things that are made in China are cheap, and et cetera. And I think about the ways in which this attitude affects just our perception of Chinese bodies within the US and globally, and also how does it change the way that I see myself. So this is an image of one of my nomadic environmental tours that I did in 2019 on the edge of a little forest in Vermont. And really everything I just talked about is the foundation for my work and my life, not because I want it to be, but because it's where my story begins temporally, culturally, racially, spatially. I didn't choose the story for myself, and I certainly didn't write it, but I was born into it, and it's my origin in the same way that my mother is my origin. You know, she was my first sound. She's the beginning of my language. So everything I do really encircles this foundation in some capacity. It's really the ground that I'm walking on. But I stand on this ground in order to look up at the sky. I'm looking up because I want to know what else is possible. I want to imagine it because I believe in potentiality. I believe in transformation, and I believe in metamorphosis. And as you can see, my work is also looking up at the sky. So I didn't really come to papermaking through like a historical or like research lens based practice, or like, I don't know what I'm saying, because I'm like really hot and I don't have AC. So basically I started making paper accidentally, and I stayed with the process over a number of years, and it's really taught me so much. It showed me things about time. When I made paper, I realized that every sheet of paper was once the body of a living tree, which you forget. Working outside made me aware of light as something that is endlessly spilling across our universe all the time, and how light is this body or this transcendental material that's not dictated by individual circumstance or distance. And light is absolutely necessary to paper making, you know, from seed to tree to et cetera. I also, making paper taught me about movement, specifically like the movement between wetness, which you see here, and dryness, you know, within the materials as it cures and hardens into a cohesive surface. I started thinking about this malleability or this transition as a metaphor for the resilience of my body, for a diasporic body, which is always shape-shifting. I also learned about myself in relationship to the body of the earth, the body of the sun, the body of the sky, the body of the cosmos. And really like making paper gave me things that no one else in this world could have given me. And I mean that, like, it was this very big, real, internal, private experience. And it was the beginning of like everything for me. So this is a sheet of paper I just made in Northern Michigan. Yeah, it's like 12 foot by 8 foot. I cut it into a little triptych. Basically, I love working with paper because I have really early memories of using the material. For the exhibition, I wrote a little tidbit like about how my grandmother and I used to pray at the Buddhist temple, and we would write our prayers on these sheets of holy paper. So really, like, I understood paper and text as transcendental objects that were capable of bridging this gap between the tangible and the intangible, you know, what we can see and what we cannot access. So essentially, I go outside every summer to make paper under the sky, and every work begins at dawn and ends at dusk. It's really a performance that centers around the birth and the death of a single day. So during this time, I'm really kind of like encirculating, or is that a word? No, encircling the rectangular structure, which you see here, and continuously pouring a mixture of water, repurposed paper, bark, pigment, like all sorts of stuff, like cardboard, you know, whatever, into the frame as I walk. And the process is rooted in circumambulation, which is a Buddhist practice of, you know, encircling a shrine or like a relic as a form of devotion. But I also think about the movement of the earth around the sun, right? The moon around the earth and the orbits of all of these celestial bodies and how that relates to cosmological time. And really all of this really wet stuff like sits in the frame. And for me, the process of pouring, which you see here, happens in layers. And I think about it in relationship to painting. So I'm not really like traditional. I'm like, screw tradition. I don't care. Sorry, no, tradition is really beautiful, but it's a starting point for me. So for me, like when painting happens horizontally and at such a monumental scale, it becomes both geography and choreography. I think about the settling of material and layers as I'm working in relationship to the sedimentation of soil over time within the landscape. What I do is also like really physical. I'm using my body to bend, lift, turn, push, lower, release, empty. And these activities remind me that there are some things that only my body can know. You know, like these movements kind of live inside of me like a memory or a feeling or like a premonition. I don't know if I'm saying that word correctly. And I carry all of these movements inside of me. And it's really a type of knowledge that can't be accessed with my intellect, that I can't access with my intellect. Yeah. So the substances, while they're wet, are really malleable and open to my touch. And I'm really kind of like working actively to shape it with my movements. And I really see the surface of the paper as this imprint of the biological act of living of an organism, me. And each sheet is this extension of my being. I see them as self-portraits, and really like through shifts in texture, color, and boundary, which you can see in this board here, they really document moments when my body is behaving in ways that cannot be accounted for via language. Right, when I cannot speak what I sense and feel. Yeah, and I also think about the fact that in many origin stories, the earth is this extension of a magical being's body. A traditional Chinese origin story is Pangu Kai Tian. And working this way is really a way for me to like remember, reclaim, and rebuild a body for myself. So I really see each sheet as a body, as its own earth and its own landscape. Yeah, I don't know how much time I have left. Okay, I'm gonna try to talk really fast. So after the pour is done, oh, this is an image of like a finished work. Everything sits outside where it's slowly dried by the sun. All the water has to fully evaporate before the disparate substances can like come off as a cohesive surface. And obviously this evaporation is invisible, but it's a really essential part of what I do. I see this evaporation of water as a temporary channel that kind of like connects land with the atmosphere. And it's a way for me to cohere my body with the body of the universe, right? And every pore is really in some way a prayer to the gods that my grandmother once told me about, you know, when we used to pray together. And you know, I think about how water is such a necessary part of papermaking, but it has to be totally absent from the final project and object in order for it to be what it is. And I think it speaks to the type of like loss or dissipation that happens in metamorphosis, which is often invisible and it's like really difficult to see and to pinpoint. So for me, like in the end, something essential is like always missing, you know, from the work or whatever. Okay, cool. So as the paper cures, because sitting outside, it's like really windy, weather happens. So like foliage and debris from the surroundings like fall into and become part of the work, which you can see here. This is a piece, a detail of a piece from Houston. And passing weather, such as like rain, heat, humidity, impact, and alter the paper surface. They kind of register as ridges or bumps or alleys, holes. You can see some of that here. So each sheet is this like remnant of site-specific activities. And it's also this aggregate of materials that kind of like can be found at a distinct location. So the work is a way for me to describe and remember a particular place at a specific moment in time, right? Because it's like temporal and it's about like time and space. Yeah, and I think like I've always been interested in navigation. I think navigation has to do with knowing where I'm situated within space and time. You know, like location affects directly what is proximate to my body. It affects the things and the landscapes and the people that I can or cannot reach. And I think this is always complicated for a diasporic body that is caught between languages and continents and memories. And really, I thought of every performance, which is the environmental core, and subsequent object, which is the paper, as a form of like map making or wayfinding. It's very similar to a photographic still. So when you see them together, the distinct sheets kind of function as meteorological and geographical coordinates. It was a way for me to map my body across distance and in time. Yeah, and so like this shows the scale of my work. You know, and I think a lot about this like mantra, which I really hate, which is like be here now. Because I often find myself thinking like, you know, because I am here, I'm not there, right? Because there's a there for me. I also think I am here, but I can't be present. So I'm somehow like in this world and not of this world. I'm kind of like floating between these two spaces. And I think this happens a lot when you immigrate because you lose your home. And when you don't know where your home is, you don't know where you are, right? You like lose your way. So I started working directly in the landscape to try to kind of like do my best to connect myself to my surroundings, to understand myself in relationship to the world. And all of it really came out of this really simple desire to know where I was and who I was, because the people we love can't always be with us, you know? Yeah, and so like the imagery in this earlier series span variations of a sphere. You know, when zoomed in, it becomes a linear gradient or some type of transition. When you zoom out, it takes on the scale of a body and becomes a portal or a window. And the spheres initially came out of the way that I was like rotating around the frame as I worked. But I later realized that they were also eyes. You know, it's the animated gaze of the work. You know, I thought if the objects that I make are sentient and can see me, I'm visible. And if I'm visible, I exist. And if I exist, then I'm real, I'm here, and I'm whole, you know, and I don't exist for you. Yeah, I don't know how much time we have left. I'm just going to try to wrap it up. So yeah, here's an image of a pour in Houston. I also see every pour as a way to offer something to my grandparents who are no longer with me. I think about my work in relationship to clouds, which kind of drift by freely in this like borderless expanse. I thought that if I did enough of these pours, that there would one day be like enough water to maybe form a single cloud, and that this cloud could travel from wherever I was in the United States to the coast of China. So essentially this cloud would be a proxy for my body. It would be this extension of my being, and it would be a way for me to go home when I couldn't go home. You know, and it's like stupid, you know, like probably didn't make a cloud. God probably doesn't exist. You know, my grandfathers never talk back at me. I don't know where they are. And it doesn't matter to me that I'll never make a cloud. It's not what it's about. All I need to know is that home once existed. And all I need to hold on to is the belief that one day I can and will go home again. Yeah, I think this is a pretty good place to end. This is a large scale composite I make by putting two or more sheets of paper together, and the vertical represents the sky, which is the skin of the universe, and the horizontal represents land, which is the torso of the earth. I also think about the relationship between being awake, being vertical, and dreaming, dying. All of that happens when the body is prone. And yeah, and I think every work comes into being in this like state of suspension between these two enormous bodies. And the installation kind of refers to that. Cool, there's some new work that I'm not going to talk about, some poems, some new work from Tucson Talk, and cool, fastest slideshow of all time. Okay, cool, awesome. I think that's it. I'm trying to stop share, but I can't see my mouse. Oh my God. I'm trying really hard.
There, I stopped it for you.
Oh my God, thank you. Thank you.
No problem. Okay,
Oh
thank you so much, all four of you. I think that was really inspiring for everyone to hear about your work. We will now move into a Q&A portion. I'm starting with the panelists. If anyone in the audience has any questions at this time, please put it into the Q&A feature at the bottom on Zoom. But I think we're going to start with the conversation between our panelists now.
Great. Thank you, Annika. So I think Stephanie and I were hoping, that, the presentations that you gave during this panel might kind of inspire some questions, that you might also see kind of maybe some connections across different traditions and practices. So we'd like to give a few minutes for you to speak to one another with any questions or aspects that you might be noticing.
I had a question for Skye. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the pattern of your design, the design that you were working from. Was that original, or where that came from? It was beautiful and complicated, and I just was curious to say more. Thanks.
Thank you. It's an original pattern of my own. I noticed that when I came home that a lot of the baskets and basketry have the same patterns, and they're probably from the early 1800s. But I really wanted to stop making those patterns because they didn't belong to me and they didn't like give me a sense of my own story. And so I started making all these different patterns, and I still do this. And it is a little more complicated to put it in a basket. It's much easier to put it in paper weavings. But that pattern specifically was made for my granny, and it's titled MRB, which are her initials. But at first it was about thinking about these boxes that we have to put ourselves into as Native artists and how to escape them, but also how to express gratitude for them as well, because we are very special peoples. And then I just, you have to be inside of them, but you also have to be outside of them. And there's ways to maneuver back and forth through all of those patterns. And that's where it first came from. And then it evolved, like when I started making the pattern for the book, it evolved into like a genealogy pattern where it was like one person was connected to the next person, connected to the next person and the next person. And so there are like genealogies of people and families. And so it's a really special pattern. It really is specifically for my granny. I guess what I noticed in all of the presentations is that there's a deep connection to home and a deep connection to our grandmas and trying to make relationships with people who have passed on. I think it's really beautiful because, I mean, that's something that I always consider, like with all the patterns, with all of the stories that sometimes don't get to be heard anymore, but they're kind of just like encapsulated in baskets or in different patterns or different, I don't like to call them mythologies because I think that they actually are real, but in like a lot of our old stories, and I'm sure each one of us have like mythological type stories. And I see that that is present in like every single person's work on this panel tonight.
I really appreciate what you just shared. And, as we were all working with these materials that I think are often categorized as, craft or craft materials. And then, historically, there's been this great divide and hierarchy between fine art and craft. And part of that, I find that there's always just this assumption that if there's geometric patterning on a vessel or within an object that is made of a craft material, then it's kind of just dismissed as decorative. And I feel like in my own work, and I'm hearing in yours, and I just believe that there's so much more that goes into a pattern potentially that can be conceptual, can be so much more that is actually related to whatever historically has been considered, a way of making, high art, fine art. I mean, not always, there's nothing wrong with decorative work either, but it's just nice to hear and to get affirmation on how much is going into, your work and just other work of this, using these materials. And thank you.
Yeah, I like to add to that. I think a lot when I make my pieces, I think a lot about a desire to hide who I am as well as a desire to show who I am. And I think a lot about the relationship between the difference and similarities between incoherence and invisibility, And I actually, Skye, I really loved what you said when you were talking about this basket weaving as a structure that you use to build a home. And then you're making this structure, because when I saw your work, I was like, oh, who is this structure for? Whose body does it hold? And then you kind of answer that question when you were giving your lecture. And then Paige, I also really loved what you said about how the process of making the material is rooted both in, it's about keeping something in your consciousness, that it has a capacity to generate language, which is like the architecture of reality. Like if we can't speak it, it doesn't exist. But then you also are connecting it with the body. So it's like internal, external. And I was like, oh my God, this is so great. I mean, this is not a question, but I was like taking notes as I was listening. And I just think there's so much like richness there, and I think it's really beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I was all excited to say something and now I can't remember what I was going to say. No, I think that all of us really look at the material, or rather the action of manipulating the material, as a connection with ancestors. I think all of us are kind of experiencing that part of, that, and I think Stephanie said that in the opening too, or maybe it was Tia talking about paper as an ancestor. But I guess maybe a comment, question, but yes, where in my practice, it embodies this massive history, at which, of course, I'm not 100% just a traditional couple maker, because I can't be, for one. We don't have all of exactly the same materials or whatever, but I am unable to be, because something happens as I'm creating my work, and I might think, okay, this is where I've got to go with this. And, there she goes. And I feel like that is an ancestor as well. It's like something else comes into me, something else happens. And it doesn't matter what I think is supposed to happen. I'm trying to do it this very specific way. And I guess maybe it's not a question, or maybe it is, like giving yourself over to either your ancestor, or that ancient Ike Kupuna is what we call it, that ancestral knowledge, or giving yourself to the material, or giving yourself to that process. Do you all find that the more you try to control it, the shittier the work is? Or if you just kind of go with it, then all of a sudden you're pleasantly surprised, which is what my experience is.
I feel like sometimes in certain communities, I guess I would say, like my own community, like I've seen it, is that sometimes traditional work, you can't use like modern materials in traditional work. And like a lot of people have issues with that. And I feel like I've been fighting that a lot. And I do make baskets traditionally too, but I guess I've kind of like separated the two from like my creative practice, which is really strange. But for me, like I never want to sell one of my baskets. I think it's like way too like precious, and I'd rather like my family have it or be used as gifts. Like all of my baskets, like I've never like once sold a basket, but I'm okay with like, selling my paper works and my paper weavings. I feel like it's part of an ancestral connection that has a lot of my own spirit in it, rather than like those traditional materials, those trees and all of those materials like hold so much life in them. And it's hard for me to like give that or like sell that and make money off of that. I feel a little like wrong in that sense. But I mean, it's all like very like fine lines between all of it, because I like my granny did sell her baskets, but it's unfortunate because we don't really have a lot in our family now, because they've been sold and sold and sold. And I only own one, and my partner just bought it for me like a few months ago. And my brother has one who he bought with my cousin. They went half on it. And I'm actually trading one of my paper weavings to someone in the community that has one of her baskets as well. And I'm going to give that one to my mom because I think she deserves it the most. But I don't know. I feel like when I start making, like I get pulled in, like you said, I do get pulled in that other direction, but I also get pulled in like a very traditional sense of making, but it's just not for, I guess, like the greater public. It's just for family.
We do have a few questions coming in the Q&A. Thanks for everything you've already shared. This one came in when Chenta was presenting, but I think it could also apply to you, Paige. Have you worked with Kozo, also paper mulberry? If so, what are the differences / similarities?
I have not. And my understanding of what distinguishes kappa from paper technically is that it's never broken down completely into a pulp and then reconstituted. It's processed in such a way that the strength of the fibers are kind of intact and held together the entire time. But Paige, you might have more to share.
I have never used Kozo, but you know, if it's Brossinetia papyrifera, which is paper mulberry, the issue is that, like, even in Hawaii, our wauke, which is what we call it, you know, it was naturalized there over 1,000 years. And so we cultivated it in such a way that, at least on Oahu and in my mala, in my garden, I have 4 different varieties, and they are vastly different from any paper mulberry that you would see elsewhere. And I've only seen, I guess, Aute in Aotearoa in New Zealand. So I think the trees all vary, you know, a lot. So there's probably a you know, a big difference in, I mean, I guess it's subtle differences, but to me, they vary a lot. The bast fiber is different when it comes to the different varieties. And as far as the paper making tradition, you know, actually some of the kapa traditions were to shred the wauke into small pieces and to ferment it and pound it. So, you know, I think some of the Japanese paper making and Chinese paper making, it's keeping those long fibers intact. So I don't know if it's just a matter of switching over to a decal and, you know, a slurry or whatever. But I think as couple makers, we all make paper out of it too. We all end up with scraps and small pieces. And so it's just part of that whole, you know, love of fiber. So you're just using it for everything. So, but sorry, I can't answer a question about Kozo.
And then I have another question about kappa. This person writes, I've heard the term kappa watermark. Can someone explain it and or show it?
Yes.
You have your tool. Do you have your watermark right there? Your beater?
No, I'm not in my home studio, but let me see. I might be able to have.
I'm not in my studio either, so I don't have
my tool. I'm trying to think how I can get some light behind this. So the watermark, it's called the ho'oki, the finishing mark. And we use a raised tool, a carved tool, that because the material kapa in Hawaii, because we ferment the material, it's like a dough-like consistency. So we are able to imprint into the actual fiber. It also is a tool. It's a finishing tool because, gosh, I wish I had an EA cuckoo with me. I'm going to try and put a light behind this. Can you see that's the print?
It's like an embossing process.
Exactly. So you can see the pattern that's in my tool that leaves that mark. It's in the kapa. So every kapa maker, you know, we all have our favorite watermarks, our favorite EA kuku that we use, but the pu'ili or the halua are the lines that are carved into our tools. And then we have the watermark side, and that side usually has to have lines that cross the parallels. And that's a tool that pulls the fibers together also. So it's kind of this beautiful finishing tool that marks the kapa, it finishes the kapa, and it leaves a very distinct impression of that particular maker, which is really cool.
Thank you. I also have a few questions for Hong Hong come in. One is simple. Do you have a pour site in Southern California this summer?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I'm in Massachusetts.
And then I have 2 questions for you, which are a little bit similar. So I'm just going to read them both. So you can address any connections between them as well. So this one person writes, I notice an aspect of your beautiful work that accentuates contrast between boundaries and borders, and these elicited feelings of tension and relationships to me. Can you speak to this, please? And then second question, interesting to link the making aspect of paper making as performance and as interaction with place. Does the location affect the type of material of the paper itself, or the substances used in the paper, i.e. edge of forest versus parking lot? Is this performance ever considered a gift to place?
Wow, really good questions. I'll try to answer all of them. I guess I'll start with the first one, which is about borders. Some of my work is made through like an additive process of piecing multiple sheets that are each made at a different place together into a whole. So, you know, I think I have a lot of borders in my work because I think about border crossing. A lot of my work is about the movement of bodies through space and in time, and the structures that sort of dictate or control that movement. I also think about sort of piecing things together because I really understand my internal experience in relationship to multiplicity, or the state of being various. I used to think that the body was like deeply singular and no one could ever understand me. And now I think the body is personal, but it can contain a lot, right? It contains myself and my lineage. It holds pain and pleasure, sadness and joy, memories and loss, dreams and gods, you know, and there's a whole world inside of me. There's this abstract expanse where language and different timelines and different places intersect and meet. And I think like me piecing all of these different materials together is a way to speak to that complexity, is to speak to that state of incoherence. That there are parts of me that I can never understand or access, that I'm a stranger to myself. And I think that's very empowering, because if I can't have it, then no one else can have it, you know, because I think sight is about possession. I have a lot of, I think about representation, but I think my work is trying to be anti-representational. I don't know. Yeah, so like, borders, lines, text, like abstraction, representation, all of it kind of colliding. And then the second question is about the relationship of the work in relation to performance and place, and whether that changes the materials. I mean, it does change the material in that it alters what kind of foliage and debris and soil and pollen lands on the surface of the work and then becomes a part of the work. You know, I think that I don't know that I think of each, sorry, my window is open because I have like 5 fans and there's like loud cars. I don't know if you can hear that. But I don't really think of the work as like a gift to a place. I think of the work as this imperfect instrument for holding time. I think about time in 2 ways. First, biological time, the time of the body, the time of the landscape. It has a beginning and an end. It's linear. And then I think about the time that's activated in storytelling and how that time is more like uncertain or malleable. And the work is really an intersection between those 2 timelines. And I think about how we can access the more malleable time every time we tell a story. And when I start a pour, I always start with a specific story in my mind, something that I want to tell, something that I want the work to speak and carry. I don't know if that answers your question, but I tried. Yeah.
Thank you. We don't have any other questions now, so unless there is anything else any of you would like to share or ask, I think we are coming to the end. So thank you.
I just like to say one thing, which is, I think I just looked up Kozo because I wasn't familiar with it, and I actually think it is the same basic paper mulberry. I think it's the same plant, but there are, you know, as Page was saying, they can be cultivated, and depending on where it's growing, and there are many different kinds. So I didn't realize that, so I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Chenta. Yes, so thank you guys so much. I thought it was really personally very inspiring to hear from all of you. And if anyone would like to support MCBA, we have a link in the chat now that you can follow to support our organization. And thank you all so much. Please, if you are local, come see the exhibition. Thank you, everyone. And thank you all for joining us tonight. Okay, you're getting lots of thank yous in the chat. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to close the meeting now. Thank you.
Thank you.